All right. This is Zach Romash. We want to welcome you to the first installment of the NCAA 2020 Data Summit series. We're going to go ahead and move forward here with the presentation. As you likely know, the 2020 NCAA Data Summit that was scheduled in Los Angeles shifted to a virtual format for the first time due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We appreciate your participation and hope that you can find these virtual sessions helpful. Please visit the Institutional Performance Program webpage on for information on additional sessions. Our first session, led by Dr. Timothy Renick, will focus on predictive analytics-based academic advisement. Dr. Renick is the Senior Vice President for Student Services and Professor of Religious Studies at Georgia State University. At Georgia State, he has served as Chair of the Department of Religious Studies and Director of the Honors Program. Since 2008, he has directed the student success enrollment efforts of the university, overseeing a 62% improvement in graduation and the elimination of all achievement gaps based on students' races, ethnicities, or income levels. Dr. Renick has testified on strategies for helping university students succeed before the U.S. Senate and has twice been invited to speak at the White House. His work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, and CNN, and cited by former President Barack Obama. He was named one of 2016's most innovative people in higher education by Washington Monthly, was a recipient of the 2015-16 Award for National Leadership in Student Success Innovation, and was awarded the 2018 McGraw Prize in Higher Education. He's the principal investigator for a $9 million U.S. Department of Education grant to study the impact of predictive analytics-based academic advisement on 10,000 low-income first-generation students nationally. Dr. Renick has allotted time to answer questions after his presentation. Please feel free to send any questions you may have using the chat feature in WebEx. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Lastly, we ask that you mute your microphone during the presentation. Thank you again for your participation. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Renick.
Great. Thank you, Zach, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending upon where you are. It's an honor to be kicking off this program, and it's an honor to talk to you about the issues that we're going to discuss this afternoon. They couldn't be more timely, given Georgia State's location, as you'll hear about, and given our role in trying to overcome what were gaping achievement gaps based on race and ethnicity. Some of these efforts and their importance for our society more broadly could not be more important. So I'm going to talk to you about a little of what we've done at Georgia State. Some of the discussion will be quite practical because I know many of you are practitioners and looking for tips and approaches that you can apply at your home campuses. To get us started, I'm going to talk about the national picture here. These are national data indicating the percent of Americans who hold a college degree, but the numbers are disaggregated by economic quartile. You're looking at the last 50 years here from 1970 to the present, and what you can see is there have been significant changes in college attainment almost entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. So what this chart shows is if you're looking at the blue line at the top, if you're among the 25% wealthiest Americans by annual household income, back in 1970, you only had about a 40% chance of holding a college degree. Now, over 82% of that portion of the American population hold college degrees. That's fantastic progress in a short period of time. But if you look at the bottom line, the red line, the bottom 25% of Americans by annual household income, the picture is much more sobering, right? We've made very little progress in the last 50 years. In fact, what you can see visually here is the gap between the wealthiest and least wealthy Americans is not getting narrower. It's basically doubled over the last 50 years. So take these national data, add to them these. Over the last 6-7 years, we've crossed an important threshold across the U.S. For the first time since these data have been collected, the majority of low-income the majority of K through 12 public school children across the United States now qualify as low income. So you can draw a line roughly from California to the DC area, and almost every state south of that line has already crossed this marker, meaning that the majority of K through 12 public school children in these states qualify as low income. So you put these two pieces together, it should give all of us concern, because we as a nation have not figured out at scale how to graduate low-income students from college, and yet the low-income students are the majority of the population working their way through the public school pipeline. It's also a good introduction to my home campus, Georgia State University. This is not just a pretty picture of the Atlanta skyline. This is Georgia State. Our biggest academic building is the white building you're looking at the right. We've got 3 or 4 other buildings in this picture just mixed into the downtown fabric of Atlanta. We have about 34,000 students on this campus, and we run 5 community college campuses around the metro Atlanta area, another 20 or so thousand students. And people, if you can mute your phones or computers, that'd be appreciated. If there's a claim to fame Georgia State has, you know, we've been overshadowed by peers throughout the state of Georgia. We're not the University of Georgia, the big flagship and football powerhouse. We're also not Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech's about 1.5 miles north of us here in Atlanta. Maybe the greatest claim to fame Georgia State has historically is our geography. We're located in the middle of a National Park Service historic district. The National Park Historic District, the Martin Luther King District, cuts our campus in half. I'm sitting here this afternoon about 3-4 blocks away from the brick building at the bottom of that screen. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King was head pastor. You walk up the block a few blocks after that, you get to his gravesite right here in downtown Atlanta. And a few blocks after that, you hit the yellow-colored house at the top of your screen. That's his childhood home, his birthplace. So we're living and working every day at Georgia State in this geography that is infused with historical significance. But the reality is, for much of our history, we did not live up to that legacy. I pulled these pictures from the Georgia State photo archives. This is what Georgia State looked like when the Reverend King was living and doing his groundbreaking civil rights work. And the reality is, Georgia State was a segregated campus. When the Reverend King was living, you know, the sad irony is the civil rights leader is living and working a few blocks away from an institution that's the very embodiment of everything he's fighting against. And much more recently than the 1960s, we were still grossly underperforming, especially with regard to our students of color. So here are our 6-year graduation rates, our bachelor's graduation rates, as of 2003, about 15 years ago. And, you know, overall, our graduation rates hovered around 30%, and we were a poster child for equity gaps. Year after year, semester after semester, the white students outperformed the students of color. The upper and middle income students outperformed our low-income students. And what makes Georgia State's story, I hope, instructive for your purposes, maybe a little bit inspirational, is that what's happened in the 15 years since these numbers were locked in would not on the surface suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround. For one thing, over this period, we've been going through significant demographic changes. When I arrived as a junior faculty member to Georgia State in the late 1980s, Georgia State was a majority white institution. We became an MSI, a minority serving institution, over a decade ago, meaning that a majority of our student population are non-white. And every year since then, we've gotten more and more diverse, to the point now where almost 3/4 of Georgia State students are non-white. The other demographic change that has been going on over this time period is our students have been getting a lot less well-resourced financially. At the start of the last recession in the late 2008, 2009, under 1/3 of Georgia State students qualified for federal Pell Grants. And what you can see happen very quickly as the recession hit is more and more students fell into low-income brackets and became eligible for Pell Grants, to the point now where it's almost 60% of the population. The reality when these recessions hit, and we're in the midst of the beginning of another by all markers, they do not distribute across the population equally. You know, it's doubtlessly the case that the families that send their sons and daughters to the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech were hurt by the recession, but they were not predominantly the families that were losing homes and jobs. These were mostly the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia State. And so we emerged into this institution that is not only minority serving, but low-income student by a significant majority of our student population. To put this in some perspective, this spring semester, we were enrolling just under 29,000 Pell students across Georgia State University. The entire Ivy League combined this spring was enrolling about 9,800. So we were trying to educate about 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League. It's not going to be business as usual. It's going to require us to approach student support in new and in some ways transformative sorts of ways. A couple other details about the last 15 years. We have not been getting more selective. Our incoming SATs have gone down as we broaden our admissions criteria, and we are not doing this with greater resources. The last recession meant that we lost over $40 million in state appropriations. And oh, by the way, for the fiscal year that begins July 1st, we've just been notified that we're going to get another $42 million cut. So this story I'm going to tell you about is not one about reaching out to the state or public sources for more money. It's not about selecting better students so your graduation rates go up because they come in better qualified and better supported. It's really about turning the mirror on ourselves and asking a simple question: are we the problem? 15 years ago, about 70% of the students who came to Georgia State left with debt and nothing to show for it. They weren't getting degrees. And yeah, it'd be nice if the state of Georgia produced better prepared high school graduates. And yes, it would be nice if the state of Georgia gave us more appropriations. But 10 years ago, we began to ask seriously the question on your screen right now. Surely if 7 out of 10 students are coming here and dropping out, we must be at least part of the problem. What are we doing that is contributing to the dropout rates at Georgia State? So we became a lot better with data. Even during the last recession, we began to invest in data teams. We used the data to analyze where we were causing problems for our students. The simple reason was these are things that are under our control. I have very little in control here as an administrator at Georgia State over K through 12 in Georgia or over the state legislature and their appropriations. I have a lot of control over how we admit students, how we advise them, how we register them. So we use the data to try to identify issues that we were creating as an institution that was causing students to drop out. We looked for solutions that were scalable. There are lots of things you can do to help students graduate at higher rates, but they are very expensive or labor intensive, so they can't be scaled up. Georgia State a decade ago said, what can we do that we can scale, not across a couple dozen students, but across thousands and even tens of thousands of students every semester? And third, because our appropriations were going down and we knew we couldn't jack up our tuition rates, we had to find things that paid for themselves, had a positive return on investment. So what I'm going to do today is describe just 3 of these programs. They all impact advising in a broad sense. They all start with a data analysis of something that Georgia State was doing that was failing our students. And I'll take you through the problems we identified, and in each case talk about the scalable solution, many of which have practical implications for your own campuses that we introduced. Here's the first example, 19%. As recently as 2015, 19% of our confirmed freshman class never made it to a single day of classes at Georgia State. This is the problem that is known nationally as summer melt. This is not the issue of your campus admitting students who go elsewhere. It's far more than 19% of the students we admit to Georgia State who end up at a different institution. This is much more insidious than that. These are students who are admitted to Georgia State, confirm they're going to come to Georgia State, come to orientation, come to registration, in some cases put down deposits, but never show up once the start of the fall semester begins. And so what we wanted to do is figure out what was happening to these students. So we used our data. We analyzed who were all the students who were scheduled to start fall of 2015 who never showed up. And we found, disturbingly, there were almost 300 freshmen who 12 months after they were scheduled to start at Georgia State never attended a single day of classes anywhere across the United States. We used National Student Clearinghouse data to track the cohort. This is what they look like: mostly non-white, mostly low income, really good candidates for graduating from Georgia State. They're finishing high school with B+ GPAs, but something's happening during the summer between them finishing high school and the first day of classes at Georgia State that's causing them to change their mind, to go from intending to go to college and even registering for college to not attending at all. And so what is that something that's happening in those 3 or 4 months? And the simple answer is Georgia State was. Georgia State and its bureaucracy and all the hoops we expected students to jump through. So we did an analysis of all the tasks we expect getting complete in the summer before they first register and matriculate as freshmen. And it's a time period, mind you, when they're no longer in contact with their high school counselors or teachers, not yet on our campuses. And embarrassingly, we found there are about 14 things they need to do. Completing the FAFSA, registering for classes, signing up for housing, all these sorts of things, taking placement exams. But we found particularly damaging when we looked at our data, the whole financial aid process. Places like Georgia State not only have to get students to complete the FAFSA, we also need to get them to respond to verification requests. I think a number of you on the phone know about the verification process, but just like the IRS runs algorithms to select certain tax returns for audits, so too the Department of Education runs algorithms to flag certain FAFSAs for further information, or what they call verification. Unlike the IRS that audits under 1% of U.S. tax returns, this past fall at Georgia State, 34% of our students were selected for verification. So on top of getting the FAFSA in, you've got this other process where students get these follow-up requests. Literally, this is not a hypothetical. We had a student, gets a note from the federal government in the middle of July. They're an incoming freshman that says, oh, we see you listed your grandmother on your FAFSA as your legal guardian and claim that your biological parents are not contributing to the finances of your family. Please provide written verification of your grandma's status as your legal guardian. And we all know how it works in low-income families. They're not going to lawyers to sign out paperwork for turning over guardianship. Mom and dad are gone. Grandma is taking over and, taking care of the kids. The student knows his grandmother doesn't have any legal documentation, and so takes this request from the federal government as a sign, I'm not going to college after all. State of Georgia has immunization requirements. Amid a pandemic, I would not criticize immunization requirements, but I can report to you that these sorts of bureaucratic steps disproportionately disadvantage underserved students. So the middle and upper income students don't have any trouble showing, producing their immunization records. It's that student being raised by grandma who doesn't have immunization records, his grandmother doesn't have any immunization records for him, and it turns out to be the roadblock to being able to go to college. So what we did for the summer of 2016 is made changes to the way we advise students through the onboarding process. Very simple ones. The first thing we did is we created a portal where students sign on to take them through the 14 or so bureaucratic steps they need to complete. If they run into trouble, there are links there that they can get help. What happens, if you can't produce guardianship papers or you don't have your immunization records? It's all very simple and low cost. The biggest advantage was because it's a portal and students were signing on to it, I began to get good data on what specifically was tripping up individual students. I used to know students were having trouble, getting ready for the first day of class or completing all their steps. Now I know this student was not having any problem until we asked for the immunization records. And then we began to have problems. So I can reach out, or my team can reach out with much more specific help. I'll say that in the 3 or 4 years since we launched this portal, it's changed our behavior as an institution. Last summer, for the first time, we hired a mobile health clinic. It parked outside of every orientation, and it provided free immunizations for the students. As they came to class to get oriented, they could get immunized. Didn't make any sense to send students home to low-income families and districts saying, oh, don't come back till you've been immunized for these two diseases and so forth, because they didn't have the capacity or the resources to solve the problem. The data has been the pathway for helping us to solve the problem or at least resolve it for more of our students. The second thing we did for the summer of 2016 is we became one of the first schools in the country to launch an AI-enhanced chatbot for student success purposes. What's a chatbot? It's just an automatic texting platform. What we did is we built up a knowledge base of over 2,000 answers to questions commonly asked by freshmen. Questions about verification and housing and signing up for classes and the FAFSA and all these sorts of issues. And we worked with a tech partner, a company called AdmitHub, to take these answers and put them on a smart device. So it's not an app students sign on to. They just go onto their regular texting platform of their smartphones and begin a conversation with Pounce. That's Pounce there, our panther, our school mascot. And from that point on, they can ask Pounce a question 24/7. The AI does not write the answer to the question. What the AI does is use algorithms to take the question and find the right answer in the knowledge base and pull it out for the student. And so when we launched this new platform in June of 2016, we estimated for our incoming freshman class, maybe it would answer 6,000 to 8,000 questions. And that would have been a huge victory for us because these would be questions that the student could ask 24/7 and get immediate responses to. In the 3 months leading up to fall classes in 2016, this chatbot, just for our incoming freshmen, answered over 180,000 questions. The response time on average was about 6 seconds. What we found when we looked in the data was really revealing. For one thing, the use of the chatbot was heavier at 1 a.m. than at 9 a.m. So all of our offices are open, advisors are there and support staff is there at 9 a.m., but the students are up asking the questions at a time when we were closed shut. The chatbot was there to answer the questions 24/7. The other thing we saw, we ran focus groups with the students that first summer to say, well, what was your experience? What did you like? What didn't you like about the chatbot? The most sobering thing we heard is we had multiple students admit to us they asked questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. They knew it was a bot. They knew it was a bot, and they knew it wouldn't be judgmental. They could ask it anything they want and get an unbiased response. And, students said they were embarrassed at times about the fact they didn't know what some of these issues were, or about the details. If you can't get your biological father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen him for the last 18 months, the last thing they said they wanted to do is go into some stranger's office and spill out their family history. They liked the fact that the bot was a tool put in their hands to help them resolve their problems. And did it help them resolve their problems? It did. So since we've had these new tools in place, both of which are relatively low cost and easy to implement, the portal and the chatbot, we have reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 37%. That translates into over 350 students who are sitting in their seats ready to go the first day of classes, who are getting winnowed out in the summer before first registration just a few years ago. And because it's worked so well with our freshmen, what we've done over the last 18 months is expand the chatbot for all our continuing students. So 24/7, from the time you matriculate to the time you graduate from Georgia State, you have this chatbot in hand. And what we've found, we've run random control trials with national researchers, is this tool has made a big difference, especially with resolving technical problems. A hold on your account, an account balance, needing to come in and see your advisor in a timely way. The students with the chatbot are responding and getting these issues resolved at rates 40, 50% higher than the students in the control groups, the students who didn't have access to the chatbot. And under the COVID circumstances of the last few months, this tool has been immensely helpful. When the governor announced in the middle of March that Georgia was closing down and students were expected to go home if they were living in dormitories, we knew we had a problem because a lot of our students don't have families to return to. Their only place to live is their dormitory. So we had to find out really quickly which students could go home and which students would have to stay in housing for the rest of spring semester. We used the chatbot. We sent the chatbot message to students out about 2 hours after the governor's announcement. Within 8 minutes, not 8 hours, within 8 minutes, we had responses from over 2,000 students about whether they were going home or whether they were staying in university housing. My second example, and the data point that kind of started us to find a solution, is this one. That back 7, 8, 9 years ago, we were dropping 1,000 students every semester who were fully academically prepared and ready to take classes at Georgia State because they couldn't cover the financial cost. They were getting dropped from an inability to pay for their tuition and fees. And when we looked at this data more closely, we found some disturbing trends. The most surprising thing was the students who were getting dropped for non-payment from their classes were, the largest subset of them were seniors. Now, seniors are really good risks for graduating. It's usually the freshmen that have the highest risk of dropping out. But what was happening, because we enroll so many low-income students at Georgia State, is it was the seniors who were running out of eligibility for their aid packages, right? I know a lot of you dealing with NCAA athletes on scholarships deal with this challenge as well. The scholarships run a limited period of time. In Georgia, the largest state scholarship, the Hope Scholarship, covers 4 years, period. If you go one semester over, you're paying out of pocket. And what we had happening was lots of very qualified students getting close to graduating and then having the scholarship run out, and then they were dropping out. Many of these students were academically on track, and many of them didn't have huge balances. It's not like they owed $15,000 or $10,000. In some cases, they owed $300 or $400. They were still walking away because they had no way. What we began in 2011 at the small scale was a program now called Panther Retention Grants. The students do nothing. They don't have to go to any office and apply for a grant. We're using data to identify students who are close to graduating and have relatively small balances and are at risk of getting dropped from their classes. Instead of dropping them, we work with the financial aid office to put these micro grants into the student's account before the drop so the students are able to continue their studies. In fact, the first couple semesters we ran this program, we were calling up students to let them know, don't make other plans Monday morning because Monday morning the last $300, $900, $1,200 on your account and you're good to go for the semester. That first couple semesters, we had multiple students hanging up on us because they thought it was a scam. They didn't believe anybody from Georgia State had just put their money this money into their account. But when you think about institutional aid, it's a very efficient way to distribute institutional aid. These seniors have a great track record of showing they can master college because they're seniors. They've already gotten to their senior year. And they don't need 4 years of support. In some cases, they just need 2 or 3 classes in order to graduate. So we focus small grants upon this group. We had never had grants like this for seniors in the past, and about 87% of the students are graduating within 1 year. In the past, if we allowed these students to stop out, only 30% were ever coming back and completing their degree programs. And because it's worked so well at the small scale, we've scaled this program up. In the last 7, 8, 9 years, we've given over 17,000 of these grants out. You may ask how we can afford to do it. And I talked earlier in this presentation about ROI, doing things that pay for themselves. Well, the Gates Foundation asked about this program and paid for Boston Consulting Group to come in and do an ROI analysis. Boston Consulting looked at 6 years of our data of Panther retention grants and concluded that the program runs in the black. It generates more revenue than it costs. We give the students on average $900. We immediately get back to $900 because it covers a gap in what they owe us for the semester bill. But the average student who's gotten a $900 grant over the last 8 or 9 years has a bill that semester closer to $2,300. So by holding on to the student, you not only get the $900 back, you hold on to the money they paid out of loans or out of pocket to try to pay their balance down. And it was this kind of data analysis that we had at our fingertips that helped us through the COVID circumstances over the last few months. You know, what a lot of campuses did to distribute their CARES Act money, the federal relief funds for students, was have an application process. So students who needed monies could come and ask for the aid. In general, that's a very slow and inefficient way of distributing aid. We did it, but over the course of the last 8 weeks, we've only been able to give about 3,700 of these grants out, totaling about 1.5 or not even 1.5 million of the CARES Act money. What we did, though, is because for Panther retention grants, we had already developed a lot of financial analytics, did a profile of the students who were enrolled spring semester. We looked at which students had the greatest unmet need, which students had the smallest expected family contribution, and distributed grants proportionate to levels of need. And in this case, within 48 hours, we distributed about 37,000 grants, totaling over $20 million. So having this data-based ability to reach out to students financially is a great way to be much more efficient and much more targeted in your distribution of federal aid or any kind of institutional aid. My last example is the one that brings us closest to our discussion of advising. And this is the third data point that spurred a development of a major program at Georgia State. Back in 2010, we had over 5,700 students who were dropping out of Georgia State every year. This is not the same group I was just referring to. Those 1,000 students we were dropping for financial non-payment. Those were students who were registered, right, and who were trying to stay enrolled, and we were dropping them because they couldn't come up with the money. This is the larger group that all of us deal with on our campuses of students who are enrolled one semester and just don't come back for a subsequent semester. And so we asked a simple question back in 2011, 2012. You know, who are these students and why are they dropping out? We did a big data analysis. That first year, we looked at 10 years of our data, 2.5 million Georgia State grades, 140,000 student records. The point was really simple. could we find in our academic data any recurring behaviors that correlated to students dropping or flunking out of the university? What do students do 6 months, 12 months, 24 months before they drop out? The premise was simple. If we could discover what they're doing before they're actually gone, we have the chance to intervene with these students. We thought maybe we'd find a few dozen statistically significant markers that predicted when a student was likely to drop out. We actually found, well, I'll give you the exact number, 859. And we've been tracking every Georgia State student for over 800 risk factors every single day for what will be, let's see, 8 years in August, right? Well over 7 years. Of course, we're not doing this manually. As we update all our student information systems, we're looking electronically for any of these 800 risk factors. If one's identified, the very next morning, the advisor assigned to that student gets an alert in his or her inbox. It says, look, over the last 24 hours, one of your students, one of the students you're responsible for, has committed a risky act academically. And part of the protocols we have in place is advisors have 48 hours to reach out to these students. What kind of things are we tracking among the 859 risk factors? A lot of it's just common sense. We have these academic maps. This is the map for our BS in chemistry. It's complicated. You know, it's a lot of small type, get a minimum grade of B+ in this course and a C or better in this other course and so forth. We were giving these maps out for, well over a decade, but we were never seeing if a student got off path and recalibrating the math for them. Now we're doing that. One of the things we track every night is the registration records by major. And we're looking for what, if a student signed up for classes over the last 24 hours, did they sign up for the right classes? Are they taking courses out of order? Are they confused about what they should be taking? And so forth. And we're flagging these students. This spring semester, 2020, we had over 3,000 instances of students who signed up for classes that didn't apply to their program. They wouldn't have gotten them any closer to graduating. And in the past, most of those students would have been allowed to pay and take those classes. Now we're identifying the problem courses before the semester begins, calling up the student, texting them, talking to them, and getting them into the right class. The predictive analytics that you heard talk about that, as Zach mentioned, look like this. This is a simple example, but hopefully it'll demystify predictive analytics. When we looked at the data, one thing we found is a strong predictor of whether a student would graduate from Georgia State successfully and on time was how they did in their first course within the major. So if you look at the center of the screen, these are real Georgia State data. What it says is if you're a political science major at Georgia State and get an A or B in your first political science class at Georgia State, you're graduating on time at above a 75% clip on average. That's great for us, right? This is this campus that started 15 years ago with 30% graduation rates. But if you get a C in that first political science class, you're graduating on time at a 25% rate. But what had we done historically with that C student? Nothing really. We'd pass them on to upper level coursework. Hopefully it'd all work out. But it didn't. The data show us that for 75% of the students, they would end up struggling. Whatever weakness, showed up in that C grade in the introductory course would become exacerbated. They may have had writing or reading issues, and then when they get into upper level coursework, it's more demanding, and the C begins to turn to a D and F. And what we were in effect doing at Georgia State and maybe at your institution is sitting there passively waiting for the near inevitable to happen in 75% of the cases. So it's not that we wouldn't reach out to these students, we would reach out to them too late. We'd sit back after the C grade, let them take a few upper level classes, they'd get D's and F's, their GPA would drop, they'd run out of compliance with SAP, they would be on academic probation, and then we would reach out to them. Now, what Georgia State is doing is reaching out to these students at the first sign of a problem. It's the first grade they get. An advisor will reach out to them within 48 hours. Are there reading and writing issues? Maybe it's the students working 40 hours a week, or maybe they're having emotional issues. But let's diagnose the problem now and get the student help now rather than waiting till the problem is exacerbated. The trick with this approach to predictive analytics-based advising is to do it at scale. And over the last 12 months at the Atlanta campus alone, we've had over 60,000 meetings between advisors and students that were prompted not by the students but by the advisors. They saw something in the data, they saw the student had made a misstep, and reached out to the students to try to offer remediation and help. We call this system for the students, by the way, GPS advising, because we wanted them to think about it like the GPS in their cars. You know, the old days you'd make a wrong turn, not realize the wrong turn, and it was hard to find your way to your destination. Well, that's just what happens on many of our campuses on a day-to-day basis. Students make a wrong turn, they make a mistake, they're registered for the wrong class, and it snowballs. Because they're in the wrong class, they end up getting a poor grade, they end up wasting their financial aid and so forth. And so what this system does is make sure, not that a student won't make a wrong turn, because they will, but once they make a wrong turn, we intervene as quickly and efficiently as possible. When we launched this platform in the summer of 2012, we immediately saw a boost in our retention rates. The biggest gains were not for our traditional freshmen. They were for our transfer students, our military learners, our part-time students. All the students who sail under the radar screen are all of a sudden getting tracked for 800 risk factors a day and getting proactive outreach when there's a problem. We also, since we launched in 2012, and you can see these numbers rather striking, have seen a significant drop in average time to degree at Georgia State. So we haven't reduced any graduation requirements. Since we launched this proactive approach to advising, the average time it takes a student to complete a bachelor's degree has dropped by about half a semester a student. If you think that, you know, is relatively modest gains, what that translates to is $18 million in savings for last year's graduating class compared to the graduating class before we launched predictive analytics-based advising, just because the students are meeting all the requirements more efficiently. They're in the right classes, they're passing the classes they're taking at a higher rate because they've got the right preparation and outreach. It's made a huge, huge difference. And maybe one of the most striking data points as a result of predictive analytics-based advising is this one, that when we launched the platform, we had a good amount of support from our faculty, in fact, overwhelming support, but there was a loud minority of faculty who raised their hand at faculty meetings and said that the system was problematic, that using predictive analytics to advise students they thought would create a system for moving students to easier majors. The premise being, if you begin advising students by probabilities, they'll all end up taking the easiest classes and be in the easiest majors. And I'm sure that's an objection some of you working with your athletes have heard repeatedly from faculty. Well, the interesting thing to this approach is its net impact has been just the opposite. Since we've launched predictive analytics-based proactive advising, we've set records every year for the number of students graduating in some of our most difficult majors. One obvious example is STEM degrees, where we've had dramatic increases in the number of students who are Black, who are African-American males, who are Hispanic, and so forth, successfully completing STEM degrees. When we looked at the data more closely, it was not because we've had a big increase in students from these populations declaring STEM majors. What we've had is a huge decline in students declaring STEM majors and then wiping out after a semester or two. We used to be perfectly happy to let an African-American male come into Georgia State and say they were pre-med and organic chemistry major, but we sat passively by while they struggled in quizzes and calculus and orgo and so forth. Now we have alerts going off as early as 2 and 3 weeks into the semester. And what might have been a D grade on a midterm, maybe it's get pulled up to a B minus. And by the final, the grade in the class is a B or a B plus, and the student is ready to go for the next semester. We've used this platform again over recent months to respond to some of the challenges of COVID. One of the new alerts we began tracking in the middle of March when we moved entirely online is logins to our online platforms. So now advisors know the very next morning if a student had an online class the previous day but didn't log on to that particular class. And this has had immense impact upon our flexibility in reaching out to students. The advisors in the first 2 weeks we came back to entirely online instruction this spring reached out to more than 3,500 students who were not logging on to their classes. In some cases, the students were academically overwhelmed, but you won't be surprised to know that in many cases it was other issues. The students had lost jobs and were facing financial hardships. The students were going through emotional issues and challenges and so forth. And what our advisors ended up doing is they kind of emerged as concierges. They made over 200 referrals in those first 2 weeks to our counseling center to get students, the emotional support they needed. But the net outcome was very encouraging. By the last week of spring semester, over 98% of Georgia State undergraduates were logging on to their online classes. And our grades, average GPA, and average DFW rates both improved over spring of 2019. And we just ended up awarding an all-time record number of degrees for a spring semester at Georgia State. So in conclusion, before we open that up to your questions and comments, let me talk about the kind of collective, the aggregate impacts that come from making these type of changes at scale. Well, the first impact, which was one we weren't expecting, is it's changed the image and reputation of Georgia State. You know, this is campus a little over a year ago. You'll maybe recognize the gentleman on the far right there. That's Bill Gates. When Bill Gates came to campus, the most striking thing is we did not invite him. He invited himself. He was going to do a keynote on World Health in downtown Atlanta, and a few weeks beforehand, his people contact us and say, oh, Bill's been reading about all you've been doing with data and technology to help especially low-income students. Would you mind if he dropped by for a couple hours? And so Bill Gates came by. He talked to me and some of my colleagues. He talked to several of our first-generation students. He didn't meet the president. It wasn't a ceremonial visit at all. He was just wanting to learn about how we were helping low-income students and students of color succeed. And that's a world of difference from where we were, 15 years ago. Or you heard in the introduction, I had the honor of speaking twice at the White House under former President Obama. I also testified in front of the U.S. Senate. The point here is these are not politically divisive issues. If you can find ways to succeed with underserved populations, students of color, low-income students, if you're all about social justice, you're going to be a hero for them. If you're all about workforce and tax base and so forth, you're going to be a hero for that group. The Republicans love what Georgia State has been doing. The Democrats love what Georgia State is doing because you are transforming lives. Another unexpected consequence of what we've been doing is it's changed the financial footing of Georgia State. Every 1% we improve our retention rates at Georgia State, it's worth about $3.3 million a year in added tuition and fee revenues. So as we've gone through some of these recessions, what has compensated for the fact that we've lost tens of millions of dollars in state appropriations is first and foremost our ability to hold on to the students who matriculate with us. We have not improved our retention rates by 1 point. We've improved them by 23 points. So we're talking about $60 to $70 million of additional revenue we've raised over the last decade alone. Of course, we're not doing it for the attention of politicians or Bill Gates or for the money first and foremost. We launched these student success programs to help students. And here's the bottom line result, that despite the fact that we are enrolling double the number of low-income students, double the number of students of color over the last decade, we've greatly decreased incoming SAT scores, so we're much more open as far as admissions is concerned. We're graduating over 3,000 additional students every year, a 73% increase. And when you look at where these gains have come from, they've come predominantly from the groups who struggled the most in the past. So we're up 73% in degrees conferred overall, but over 100%, almost 200% to groups like our African American, our low income, and our Hispanic students. Not because these programs are targeted by race, ethnicity, or income level. All of these programs are equally scaled across the entire Georgia State population. But the students who have benefited the most are the students who struggle the most under the old bureaucracy, because these are students who don't have a support system at home to help them navigate the various challenges of college. When it comes to graduation rates, they have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. So the blue bars are where we started in this presentation about 30 minutes ago, where we were at Georgia State 15 years ago. You'll see that they've doubled, more than tripled for a number of our students. We have more than doubled our graduation rate for our African American students. We've almost tripled it now for our Hispanic students. And for 6 years in a row now at Georgia State, our African American, our Hispanic, and our low income, our Pell students have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. And this campus in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s and still grossly performing, especially for students of color a decade ago, now and for 5 years in a row confers more bachelor's degrees to African American students than any other college or university in the United States. And isn't that a more fitting, testimony to this native son whose, National Park Service historic district we share? My last couple of slides here, I'm going to anticipate two questions that I'm asked most often about what we've done at Georgia State. The first one is, sure, you're graduating a lot more students, but are they doing anything after graduation? Are they learning anything? Is it making any difference? The reality is the average Georgia Tech graduate earns more than the average Georgia State graduate. But the average Georgia Tech student is coming from the upper 25% of Americans' biannual household income and going predominantly into engineering and science careers. So look at a different marker here. Look at social mobility. What is the impact of a campus in taking students from one social economic status as they matriculate and helping them achieve a higher socioeconomic status after graduation? And by that marker, Georgia State does amazingly well, and quite frankly, a lot better than Georgia Tech. Out of 2,000 institutions ranked by the Brookings Institute, we're number 25 in the nation for moving students from lower income to the upper half of Americans' biannual household income. U.S. News and World Reports puts us at number 8 by that marker. The second question I'm often asked is, sure, it works at Georgia State, but will it work at my home institution? We're different in lots of ways, and will these programs work there? Well, we've had a number of campuses that are success stories, but the state of Georgia gave us the best test case about 4 years ago because they assigned to Georgia State, they consolidated with Georgia State, the largest community college system in the state of Georgia. Georgia Perimeter College enrolls 20,000 students, 5 campuses around Metro Atlanta, and at the time of consolidation, the graduation rates there were 6.5%. And what we've done by rolling out the same programs I've described to you today is basically triple those graduation rates over the last 4 years. We're not done yet, but they're now up 19%. This fall, we're going to hit 22% by the tracking that we're doing currently. More than that, by a more important marker, is a student graduating with an associate's degree, or is the student successfully transferring to a 4-year institution? Georgia Perimeter College, after 4 years of these type of impacts and these type of initiatives, now ranks in the top 20 among community colleges nationally, according to the Chronicle of Higher Education. 83% of the students are now graduating or successfully transferring to a 4-year institution. So these type of approaches are scalable, they're affordable, and they make a transformative difference. And so I'm anxious to hear what kind of questions and comments you have, but I urge you to think about the ways, especially under these very challenging times, you can better support the students who entrust their future with us on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Renick. We appreciate your time. I'm sure everybody found that tremendously helpful. So what we'll do now is we'll open up to questions. You can use the chat feature, and then we will convey your question and then allow Dr. Renick to respond. So please use the chat function here, and I will go ahead and pull that up and get this started here.
This is Steve Clare. I'll jump in here to Renick with a couple of the questions. I'm kind of grouping two together. But folks are wanting to know how the predictive analytics you talked about will help student athletes be successful, and sort of the combination question there is, how do athletic administrators help with this type of work? So if you could speak to that, I think some folks would be want to hear your thoughts on those pieces.
Yeah, great question. So thank you, Steve. First off, I want to compliment you and the work you do, because in all honesty, some of the models we've used for scaling across Georgia State are based upon some of the principles that well-running athletic departments use to support their athletes academically, right? The trick, in essence, is not to let problems fester, to identify them early, and to get to the students as quickly as possible. So in that respect, in many ways, we learned a lesson from you on the phone today by being as careful of tracking students and staying in touch with them on a day-to-day basis. But the way I think these approaches can help is by opening your eyes to things that you may not be seeing, right? I assume that most of you who are in regular contact with your athletes might know if a student's not attending class. In point of fact, if you don't know as quickly as you'd like to, some of the technologies will help, right? Logins to, for instance, LMSs and online platforms can be a really reliable way of determining whether the student is attending without having to go to the faculty member and have them flag it to you once or twice a semester. You can get this information in real time. So that's one detail. The other detail is what we found is that there were things that we had not seen before we looked at the data that's really helpful information to get to the students. So the one example that I gave that would be most pertinent here is knowing that a C grade in a political science class is really a sign of great risk. In the past, we might have been very satisfied in our central advising office, and maybe even our academic advisors in our athletics department might have been happy, oh, a student passed the course, they got a C, so we're good to go. And yeah, you might be good from an eligibility perspective, but what we see when we look at the data, the aggregate data over 10 years at Georgia State, is that's a warning sign. And if you act on it quickly, instead of assuming everything's okay and going on to the next issue, you can head off problems that, as you can see from the data, are almost inevitable in the future. I mean, if you knew that in getting behind the wheel of your car, you had a 75% of crashing this morning, then you would have probably thought about, well, maybe I need to go to the repair shop and have the car diagnosed before I get behind the wheel. And that's in effect what the predictive analytics allow you to do. To say to a student, maybe you haven't crashed yet, but the data show you're going to, and so let's do the corrective actions now so you never have that accident in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Renick. I'm going to keep going kind of in the order that we've got the questions so that we're sensitive to your time. This is a question, I think, about prospects or high school students who don't see this type of real-time intervention in K to 12. How do you socialize your incoming students for this type of culture so they're prepared to get this type of proactive contact from your advisors?
Yeah, that's a great question, something we've thought about. And I'll say that it turned out to be less of a problem than we had feared. For one thing, as far as our chatbot is concerned, this tool that takes the students from high school graduation to the first day of college classes, we now put it as part of the application. We ask the students, as they're applying to Georgia State, do you want to stay in touch with us and be able to communicate us with via text and get them to share their cell phone number? We get very high participation. I mean, that's when students are really motivated to be collaborative and cooperative. So we get them at the front end then. And then because all these programs are scaled, and I didn't mention this earlier, I think one of the advantages of scaling some of these approaches across the whole student body is they don't become stigmatized, right? We've heard from students at times, when you offer special programs for just your low-income students or just your African-American males, they feel by just showing up to the programs that you're already telling them that they're lesser, that they are stigmatized in some ways. At Georgia State, every student comes in and has this kind of approach. And so I think the students very quickly just say, that's the way college works. In fact, I'm always struck at the end of the December break, the holiday Christmas type break, we have freshmen coming back after they've gone back to their high schools and talked to their friends. And I've had a couple say to me, oh, I was surprised when I talked to my friends that, I thought every college student was getting tracked for 800 risk factors every day and having their advisors reached out to them and so forth. They just assumed that that's the way college works. So, you take your average 17-year-old, they're fairly malleable. They don't know a lot about college to start with. And if this is the way you present college as working, they can adapt fairly quickly, and they become part of the group that tell the next generation of incoming freshmen, oh, of course that's the way it works at Georgia State. You're going to meet your advisor. They're going to contact you after you register for classes to make sure you sign up for the right classes and so forth. It's become enculturated relatively quickly.
That's great. Thanks. A couple of questions in and around how you at Georgia State got buy-in both from your faculty and from your students, and then maybe a related one is the type of training you did for both groups initially so they're aware of what would be happening.
Those are really good questions too. Early in the presentation, I said one of our strategies was to ask, are we the problem? And I was suggesting that at the macro level, right? Are we the problem, Georgia State, compared to legislature compared to K through 12. But when we launched these programs, we took that motto and that question seriously at the micro level as well, meaning that what I launched first over the last, we've been doing this basically for 12 years now, is a set of programs that concentrated not on the faculty having to make changes, but the administration making changes. Look at the examples I gave to you today. So we talked about using a chatbot to better onboard students as they're first registering, using data in order to distribute financial aid in a more targeted way, or using data in order to advise students in a more focused way and proactively. All of those are not predominantly faculty-run initiatives. Like, our faculty are not the ones to register students and admit them to the university. They're not the ones to distribute financial aid. And at Georgia State, we have an advising office of professional advisors, so they're not the ones predominantly advising the students day to day. All of those were administrative functions. So one way we got faculty buy-in was to start with ourselves, saying we need to get our own house in order. And what's happened in recent years is now the faculty have said, oh, I see how this works, and I see you're not out to get my job, so we're going to contribute as well. We've had a number of faculty redo the academic requirements for their programs based on the predictive analytics data. For instance, in economics, our faculty saw that students were really struggling in the first microeconomics course and not getting early concepts because all these alerts were going off. So rather than blaming the students and seeing that we had created an environment where innovation was embraced, they said, oh, well, let's redesign the first third of the microeconomics course so that students will do better. Our entire nursing program has been redesigned. So the faculty got on board after seeing that this was not a threatening thing, but an opportunity for us to serve our students in better ways. As far as getting the students on board, we made a pledge that we would not track any personal data about the students. So we're not tracking them on GPS. We're not tracking who's checking into the dorms, you know, at 1 a.m. Maybe your coaches are, but we're not going to do it. We're not tracking who's going to the library and who's not. We're using data we've always used about students, about their grades, their registration records, their academic history, which we've always collected data about, and using it in a way to help students. So we're not making this something that is kind of big brother looking at you personally on day-to-day basis. We're saying, we already have all this data about you. We have to collect your grades and your registration records and your majors and minors and all that, or we wouldn't be accredited. Let's finally use it to your benefit. So we're going to give you some warning. In fact, when we launched our predictive analytics and advising, one of the most common reactions we got the first couple semesters is, where was this system when I first enrolled? Because the students saw it as something that was really helpful, like the chatbot at 1 a.m., you know, getting told that if you're a political science student and you struggle in that first political science course, you need to get help now. That the students saw as really useful and helpful information, not as threatening.
Thank you very much. Do you have time for one more?
Absolutely.
Okay, and I know folks may have to run, but we got a number of questions around the IT piece of this, and sort of multiple question here, multiple parts. Was it developed in-house? What was the cost to get it going? And then if you don't, on a campus, have a strong IT program or commitment, is this something, in your opinion, that an athletics department might be able to tackle?
Yeah, great questions, too, and I get asked that all the time as well. In effect, I think what I described today is less an IT and more a data challenge. So if you have those functions in different parts of the university, what you need to pay more attention is the data side than the IT side. The reality is most of the technology runs in cloud-based systems, and so we don't interact a lot with our IT people. We interact a lot with our data people. And so what we had to do early on, and where we did put a number of resources, hundreds of thousands of dollars of resources, is getting our data team to be much stronger, hiring up data analytics people. I write grants, and when I write grants now, I often put a data person in the grant. I have, you know, down the hall from me, a couple of data people who work in my suite of offices to run data, because that's what's really important. And I'll say that that may also be the answer to your question about if you're in an athletics department that doesn't have real strong IT or data on your campus, is there anything you could do? I'd say yes, that we have 859 risk factors we're tracking for students. I'll tell you, after doing it now for 8 years, there are some risk factors and markers that come up again and again, and others that we only use occasionally. And a lot of the ones that are most impactful are really obvious ones that most of you have access to the data already. For instance, one of our biggest risk factors, one of the most important alerts we track every day at Georgia State, is a student dropping and withdrawing or withdrawing from their classes in the middle of a semester. A really simple thing. It's not a complicated data point to track because your registrar knows, in many cases you know, or you have holds on accounts if a student's dropping or withdrawing from a class. But I'll say at Georgia State, we had never tracked this across the student body. We just allowed students to drop or withdraw classes, and we'd talk to them 6 months later. That's an early warning sign that a student is in distress, right? If they're so struggling with a class, they're even having an academic problem or a personal issue or a financial issue that needs to be addressed immediately. Another example I gave in the presentation, look at the first grade a student gets in his or her major. I would be shocked if that's not highly predictive of graduation rates at your institution. We found across all our majors, it was a very predictive point. And so you don't need a fancy data team for that either. If a student's muddling along and maybe getting lots of C grades and so forth, hone in on how they did in the first course in their academic major, because you can be assured that whatever that first grade is going to be challenged as they attempt more and more detailed work as they move up the chain. You know, the data is useful for some really nuanced points, finding what we call toxic combinations, courses that students take in combination where they have a much higher chance of failing because they're taking the courses the same semester. But it's not necessary to look at the early quizzes that a student is taking in the semester. And if a student is struggling in the first couple weeks, getting them help immediately. These are really basic principles of intervention that work across the board, and they don't require all kinds of fancy technologies. The reality is, for those of you who want to know, we have partnered over the last 8 years with EAB, so we use EAB platform for our predictive analytics in advising, but we're using our own data team for the analytics we use for the microgrants and financial aid, and we used our own team to help develop the chatbot and the knowledge base we use for the chatbot. So really, of the programs I described today, one of them is more out-of-house and two of them are more in-house programs.
Dr. Renick, thank you very much for your time. We've run over. I just want to thank everyone for attending. Those questions that we didn't get to, we will send to you separately and work to get responses to those who've asked them. But really appreciate it. I'll give you a chance for a closing argument if you'd like.
Yeah, well, one, I did see the question come up about the slides. Steve and Zach can share my slides any way they think appropriate. That's fine. In fact, we'll have this whole presentation taped should you want to share it or use it. I guess the closing charge is this. I grew up in a generation of scholarship that looked at equity gaps, achievement gaps in graduation, and found in research that these gaps often had origins very early on in a student's education. You know, we can find achievement gaps not only in 9th grade and 8th grade reading, but we can find them in 3rd grade math scores. We can even find them in pre-K performance. But what Georgia State tells us, which is very important, is that while those achievement gaps may predate the time the students come under our charge and begin to work with us, we have a lot more power in our hands than we give ourselves credit for. We have the ability in a relatively short period of time, by supporting students systematically and with data, to overcome a lot of those equity gaps. And I think that's the most important lesson of Georgia State.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, especially Dr. Renick and Zach, for setting this up. I think that is all we have today.
Thank you much.
Yep, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Renick.